The crowd gathered like vultures around fresh carrion. In the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, beneath the scorching noon sun, 19-year-old Cordelia Walsh stood trembling on the auction platform, her pale hands clutching the worn fabric of her only dress. But this wasn't a cattle auction. This was something far more sinister. Silas Blackwood leaned against the saloon post, his gold teeth gleaming as he smiled at his prize. The debt was clear. Her guardian's gambling addiction had cost him everything, and now Cordelia would pay the price. The town watched in uncomfortable silence as Sheriff Morton prepared to hand over the terrified girl. To settle a debt that should never have involved human flesh, Cordelia's mind raced with desperate thoughts. How had it come to this? 3 months ago, she was helping Mrs. Patterson with her bakery, dreaming of maybe teaching school someday. Now, she stood like livestock, about to become the property of the most brutal man in 3 counties. Her heart hammered against her ribs as Blackwood's cold eyes traveled over her body, calculating his investment. The sheriff cleared his throat, avoiding Cordelia's pleading gaze. Everyone knew what Blackwood did to the women who fell into his hands. The last girl had lasted 6 months before she was found floating in Mill Creek. But debts were debts, and the law was the law, even when it stank worse than a week-old corpse. Blackwood pushed away from the post and began walking toward the platform, his spurs jingling with each confident step. The crowd parted before him like he was Moses himself. Though their reasons had nothing to do with respect, fear had a way of clearing paths just as effectively. Cordelia's legs nearly gave out as she watched her fate approaching. She thought about running, but where could she go? The desert stretched for miles in every direction, and she had no money, no family, no protection. Her guardian, drunk as usual, cowered behind the crowd, unable to meet her eyes after selling her future for his gambling debts. Just as Blackwood reached the bottom step of the platform, his hand already extended to claim his prize, a voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. "Hold on there, Silas." Every head turned toward the voice. Standing at the edge of the crowd was Marlowe Thorne, the man nobody wanted to cross, but everyone tried to avoid. His weathered face was set in stone, his gray eyes fixed on Blackwood with an intensity that made even the bravest men uncomfortable. But what Marlowe said next would change everything and reveal a secret that had been buried in Copper Ridge for 20 long years. Marlowe stepped forward through the crowd, his boots making no sound on the packed dirt. The townspeople instinctively moved aside, creating a wide path between him and Blackwood. Everyone knew the stories about Marlowe Thorne, the man who'd killed 3 claim jumpers with his bare hands, who'd burned down a corrupt sheriff's office in Deadwood, who lived alone on his ranch with ghosts that no one dared name. Blackwood's confident smirk faltered for just a moment before returning full force. He'd been waiting for this confrontation for years, ever since Marlowe had embarrassed him at the poker table and cost him a fortune. Now seemed like the perfect time to settle old scores in front of the whole town. Well, Blackwood sneered, his hand resting on his gun belt. The hermit crawls out of his hole. "You got no business here, Thorne. This is between me and the girl's guardian." Marlowe's gray eyes never left Blackwood's face as he continued his steady approach. The silence stretched tight as a hangman's rope. Even the horses seemed to sense the electricity in the air, stamping nervously and shaking their heads. "The business I got here," Marlowe said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume, "is that debt's been paid." A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Sheriff Morton stepped forward, confusion creasing his weathered features. The lawman had seen enough standoffs to know when violence was about to explode, and right now the air felt ready to ignite. "Now hold on, Marlowe," the sheriff said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This here's a legal matter. The girl's guardian owes Blackwood near to $1,000. That's more money than this whole town sees in 6 months. Marlowe reached into his coat, causing several men to instinctively step back and touch their weapons. But instead of iron, he pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. He tossed it at the sheriff's feet, where it landed with a heavy thud that seemed to echo off every building in town. "Count it," Marlowe said simply. Cordelia watched in stunned disbelief as the sheriff knelt and opened the pouch. Gold eagles spilled onto the dusty street, more money than she'd ever seen in her life. The afternoon sun caught the coins, sending flashes of light dancing across the faces of the mesmerized crowd. Blackwood's face had turned the color of raw beef. His plans were crumbling before his eyes, and everyone could see it. But Silas Blackwood didn't become the most feared man in the territory by accepting defeat gracefully. "That's real touching, Thorn," he snarled, his hand now openly hovering over his colt. "But some things ain't for sale. I had a legal agreement, and I intend to honor it." The crowd began backing away, sensing the storm about to break. Mothers pulled their children behind buildings. Shopkeepers quietly retreated into their stores. Only Cordelia remained frozen on the platform, caught between salvation and catastrophe. Marlowe took another step closer to Blackwood, close enough now that their confrontation had become personal, intimate, and deadly. But neither man was prepared for what Cordelia was about to reveal, a truth that would expose the real reason Marlowe Thorne had lived like an outcast for 2 decades. Cordelia's voice cut through the tension like a church bell on Sunday morning. Clear and desperate and impossible to ignore. "He's my father." The words hit the crowd like a lightning strike. Every conversation died, every breath caught. Even the wind seemed to pause as 20 years of carefully buried secrets clawed their way to the surface in broad daylight. Marlowe's granite expression cracked for the first time anyone could remember. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he looked up at the girl on the platform. Really looked at her and saw what everyone else was now seeing, the same gray eyes, the same stubborn jawline, the same way of holding her shoulders when cornered. Sheriff Morton's mouth hung open like a barn door in a storm. "That ain't possible. Marlowe Thorne ain't got no family. Everyone knows that." But Cordelia was already climbing down from the platform, her movements urgent and clumsy in her desperation. "My mother was Elizabeth Walsh. She worked at the hotel 20 years ago. She told me before she died. She told me who my real father was." The crowd pressed closer despite the danger, hungry for details that would feed gossip for months. This was better than Christmas, and the 4th of July rolled into one scandal-soaked package. Blackwood's face had gone from red to purple to a sickly white. His carefully laid plans weren't just falling apart. They were exploding in his face like a stick of dynamite. "You're lying," he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. "Elizabeth Walsh was a whore who took money from half the men in this territory." Marlowe moved so fast that most people missed it. 1 second, and he was standing 10 feet away. The next, his fist was connecting with Blackwood's jaw with a sound like an axe hitting hardwood. The brutal man spun twice before hitting the dirt, blood streaming from his split lip. "Watch your mouth when you speak about her," Marlowe growled, standing over Blackwood's prone form. "Elizabeth was worth 10 of you." Cordelia reached them just as Blackwood was struggling to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun, but Sheriff Morton stepped between them, his own weapon drawn, and pointed at the ground in warning. "That's enough," the lawman shouted. "Everybody calm down before somebody gets killed." Blackwood wiped blood from his mouth, his eyes burning with humiliation and rage. Being knocked down in front of the whole town was bad enough, but being knocked down to defend a dead woman's honor was the kind of insult that demanded blood payment. "This ain't over, Thorne," he snarled, backing toward his horse. "Not by a long shot. That girl owes me, and I always collect what's mine." As Blackwood mounted his horse and rode away, Cordelia finally stood face to face with the father she'd never known. But the reunion she dreamed of was about to become a nightmare. When they discovered what Blackwood had left behind, the crowd began to disperse, but their whispers followed them like dust clouds after a stampede. Marlowe stood awkwardly before Cordelia, this man who could face down armed killers but seemed terrified of his own daughter's expectant gaze. "Elizabeth, she never told you anything else about me?" Marlowe asked quietly, his voice rougher than usual. The weight of 20 lost years pressed down on his shoulders like a mountain of regret. Cordelia shook her head, her own emotions warring between hope and fear. "Just your name, and that you were a good man who'd gotten a bad reputation. She made me promise never to look for you unless—" Her voice trailed off. Unless what? Unless I had no other choice. The honesty in her words hit Marlowe harder than Blackwood's return punch would have. Here was his daughter, his flesh and blood, and she'd only sought him out because she was desperate. 20 years of self-imposed exile suddenly felt like the coward's choice it had always been. Sheriff Morton cleared his throat, still trying to process what he'd witnessed. Marlowe, I got to ask, did you know about the girl? Marlowe's gray eyes found Cordelia's face again. Memorizing features he should have watched grow and change over the decades. Elizabeth came to see me once, about 19 years ago. Said she was carrying my child, but didn't want nothing from me. Said a man like me would only bring trouble to a baby. The pain in his voice was so raw that even hardened cowboys looked away. She was protecting you, Cordelia whispered, from the bounty hunters, from the men who wanted you dead. Before Marlowe could respond, young Tommy Patterson came running down the street like his pants were on fire. The boy skidded to a stop in front of the sheriff, gasping for breath and pointing back toward the edge of town. Sheriff Morton, you got to come quick. There's riders coming, at least a dozen of them, and they're flying Blackwood's colors. The blood drained from Marlowe's face. Silas Blackwood had never been the type to accept defeat gracefully, but bringing an army back to Copper Ridge meant he was planning something far worse than a simple fight. This was about revenge, territory, and sending a message that would echo across the entire territory. Sheriff Morton checked his gun and looked around at the handful of men still in the street. Most of the townspeople had already scattered to their homes and businesses, sensing that trouble was riding in with the dust clouds on the horizon. How much time we got, boy? Morton asked. Maybe 10 minutes, Sheriff. They're riding hard and they look mean. Marlowe's mind was already calculating odds and escape routes. 1 man against 12 was suicide. By taking Cordelia and running would mean abandoning the town that had given him a chance when no one else would. The decision should have been easy. Save his daughter and let Copper Ridge fend for itself. But as he looked into Cordelia's eyes, he saw something that changed everything. She wasn't afraid. She was angry, and she was looking at him like she expected him to fight. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and with it came the promise of violence that would test every choice Marlowe had made in the last 20 years. The thunder of hoofbeats grew closer, as Marlowe made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of running, he turned to face the approaching storm with his daughter by his side. Cordelia, get behind the water trough, he ordered, but she didn't move. I'm not hiding anymore, she said firmly. These men came for me. I won't let innocent people die because I'm a coward. Marlowe felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. She had Elizabeth's courage and his stubborn streak, a combination that could get her killed. The irony wasn't lost on him that after 20 years of avoiding fatherhood, his first real conversation with his daughter might also be his last. Sheriff Morton positioned himself beside Marlowe, his weathered hand steady on his rifle. You know, Thorne, I always figured you for a loner. Never thought I'd see you make a stand for anybody else. Neither did I, Marlowe admitted, checking his Colt for the 100th time. But some things are worth dying for. The riders appeared at the end of Main Street like a vision from hell. 12 men, all heavily armed, with Blackwood leading the charge on a black stallion that seemed to breathe violence. Dust swirled around them like smoke, and the late afternoon sun caught the metal of their weapons, turning them into harbingers of death. As they approached, Marlowe could see this wasn't just about Cordelia anymore. Blackwood's eyes burned with the kind of hatred that demanded bloodlots of it. This was about respect, territory, and showing the entire territory what happened to men who crossed Silas Blackwood. The riders spread out across the street, surrounding the small group of defenders. Most of the townspeople had barricaded themselves inside buildings, but Marlowe could see rifle barrels poking through windows. Copper Ridge might be small, but it wasn't defenseless. Blackwood dismounted slowly, savoring the moment like fine whiskey. His split lip had swollen, making his smile even more grotesque than usual. Well, the great Marlowe Thorne, making his last stand over a whore's bastard. Marlowe's hand moved to his gun, but instead of drawing, he did something that shocked everyone. including Blackwood. He smiled a cold, dangerous smile that reminded everyone why men had feared him across 3 territories. "Silas," he said calmly, "before you start shooting up my town, there's something you should know about that debt you're so worried about collecting." Blackwood's confidence wavered slightly. "What are you talking about?" "The money your gambling house took from Cordelia's guardian. It came from stolen silver, federal silver, which makes you and every man riding with you accessories to a federal crime." The revelation hit Blackwood's men like a bucket of ice water, and suddenly the odds weren't looking quite so favorable. Blackwood's face went white as fresh snow. The silver mine robbery 3 months ago had been the talk of the territory. Federal marshals were still hunting the men responsible, and the reward money had every bounty hunter from Denver to Santa Fe asking questions. "You're lying," Blackwood snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. Several of his men were already exchanging nervous glances, clearly rethinking their loyalty to a boss who might get them all hanged. Marlowe reached slowly into his vest pocket, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He pulled out a small silver ingot, still bearing the federal mint stamp, and held it up where everyone could see it clearly. "Found this in your gambling house safe 2 weeks ago," Marlowe said calmly. "Been wondering what to do with it ever since. Funny thing about federal silver, it has a way of making people remember things they'd rather forget." The lie rolled off Marlowe's tongue smooth as silk, but it landed like a sledgehammer. He'd actually taken the silver from his own legitimate mining claim, but Blackwood didn't know that. The mere possibility of federal involvement was enough to make even the hardest man nervous. 3 of Blackwood's riders were already backing their horses away from the confrontation. Federal crimes meant federal hangings, and no amount of money was worth dancing at the end of a rope. The smart ones knew when to cut their losses and run. "Even if that's true," Blackwood said desperately, "it don't change nothing. The girl still owes me, and I mean to collect." "No," Sheriff Morton interrupted, stepping forward with newfound authority. "She don't owe you nothing. Silas, a debt based on stolen money ain't legal, and you know it." Cordelia watched in amazement as her father's gamble played out. Without firing a shot, he turned a dozen armed men into a handful of increasingly nervous criminals. But she could see in Blackwood's eyes that desperation was making him dangerous in a whole new way. Blackwood's hand moved to his gun, his face twisting with rage and humiliation. "I don't care about federal silver or legal debts. I came here for the girl, and I ain't leaving without her." The remaining 6 men with Blackwood tightened their grips on their weapons, but their hearts weren't in it anymore. Fighting for their boss was one thing. Dying for his wounded pride was something else entirely. Marlowe took a step closer to Blackwood, his gray eyes locked on the other man's face with laser intensity. "Then you're not leaving at all, Silas." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone present understood what Marlowe was offering. Single combat, winner takes all, loser feeds the vultures. It was an old tradition in the territory, respected even by men who respected nothing else. Blackwood's remaining men relaxed slightly. A fair fight between their boss and Marlowe would settle the matter with honor, regardless of the outcome. No one would face federal charges, no one would hang for following orders, and the best man would win. But Blackwood had never been interested in fair fights, and what happened next would prove just how far he was willing to go to claim his prize. As the 2 men faced each other in the dusty street, neither of them noticed the glint of metal from the roof of Henderson's general store, where a hidden rifleman was taking careful aim. Cordelia's sharp eyes caught the deadly glint from the rooftop just as the hidden rifleman's finger tightened on the trigger. 20 years of living on the edge of survival had taught her to notice things others missed, and right now, what she noticed was about to kill her father. "Marlowe, get down," she screamed, throwing herself forward just as the rifle cracked like thunder from above. The bullet meant for Marlowe's heart instead caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to one knee in the dust. Blood immediately began soaking through his shirt, but he was alive. Barely. Blackwood's face lit up with savage satisfaction. The hidden rifleman had been his insurance policy, a way to guarantee victory even if his courage failed him. "Looks like the great Marlowe Thorne ain't so tough after all," he sneered, drawing his Colt. But Cordelia was already moving, in one fluid motion. She scooped up her father's fallen gun and pointed it directly at Blackwood's chest. Her hands were steady, her gray eyes blazing with the same cold fire that had made Marlo Thorne a legend. "You want to finish this," she said quietly, "then finish it fair." The street erupted in chaos. Sheriff Morton was trying to spot the hidden rifleman while keeping his weapon trained on Blackwood's remaining men. The townspeople who'd been watching from windows were now scrambling for better cover. And somewhere above them, a killer was reloading for another shot. Blackwood laughed, but there was hysteria in the sound now. "You think I'm afraid of some girl playing with her daddy's gun? You probably don't even know which end the bullets come out of." Cordelia's response was to cock the hammer with her thumb, the metallic click cutting through the noise like a blade. "My mother taught me to shoot when I was 12. Said a woman in this territory needed to be able to protect herself from men exactly like you." The confidence in her voice gave Blackwood pause. This wasn't some terrified girl anymore. This was Elizabeth Walsh's daughter, raised hard and taught to survive. The resemblance to her mother was suddenly unmistakable, and it brought back memories Blackwood had tried to bury. Marlo struggled to his feet, using his good arm to steady himself against the hitching post. Blood loss was making him dizzy, but pride kept him upright. Watching his daughter face down armed killers filled him with terror and admiration in equal measure. "Cordelia," he said through gritted teeth, "you don't have to do this. Get behind cover and let me handle it." "No," she interrupted, never taking her eyes off Blackwood. "You've been handling things alone for 20 years. It's time you had someone watching your back." The rifle cracked again from the rooftop, but this time Sheriff Morton was ready. His return shot sent the hidden gunman tumbling from Henderson's roof with a scream that ended abruptly when he hit the ground. Now it was just Blackwood and 5 nervous riders against a wounded man, a determined girl, and a town that was finally ready to fight back. But Blackwood still had one more card to play, and it was about to change everything. Blackwood's eyes darted around the street, calculating his dwindling options. His rifleman was dead, half his men had abandoned him, and now a girl was pointing the gun at his heart with the steady hand of someone who knew how to use it. But Silas Blackwood hadn't survived 20 years in the territory by giving up when things got difficult. "You want to know something interesting about your precious father?" Blackwood called out, his voice carrying across the silent street. "Ask him about the Cartwright family. Ask him why he really left civilization behind." Marlowe's face went ashen, and it wasn't from blood loss. "Don't," he warned, his voice barely above a whisper. But Blackwood was already talking, his words designed to cut deeper than any bullet. "Tell her, Marlowe, tell your daughter how you killed an entire family over a card game. Tell her why there are bounty hunters still looking for you after all these years." Cordelia's gun hand wavered slightly, but she didn't lower the weapon. "I don't care what he did before," she said firmly. "I care about who he is right now." The simple statement hit Marlo like a physical blow. After 20 years of carrying guilt and shame, his daughter was offering him something he'd never dared hope for. Forgiveness without explanation, acceptance without conditions. Sheriff Morton used the distraction to move closer to Blackwood's remaining men. "It's over, boys," he called out. "Your boss is done, and you know it. Ride away now, and nobody else has to die today." 3 more riders exchanged glances and quietly backed their horses away from the confrontation. They'd sign on to intimidate a small town, not to die for their boss's wounded pride. Only 2 men remained at Blackwood's side, and their loyalty was looking shakier by the minute. Blackwood's desperate gamble had failed. Instead of turning Cordelia against her father, his revelation had only strengthened her resolve. The girl standing before him wasn't just Elizabeth's daughter. She was Marlowe's too, with all the stubborn courage that implied. "Last chance, Silas," Marlowe said, struggling to stay upright despite his wound. "Ride away now, and we'll call it even. Stay and finish this, and only one of us is walking away." For a moment, Blackwood hesitated. He could see the writing on the wall. His men were abandoning him, the town was against him, and his chances of winning a straight fight were getting worse by the second. A smart man would have cut his losses and lived to fight another day, but Silas Blackwood had never been accused of being smart. "I'd rather die than be humiliated by some bastard child and her outlaw father," he snarled, raising his gun toward Cordelia. He never got the chance to fire. 3 shots rang out simultaneously, Cordelia's, Marlowe's, and Sheriff Morton's. Blackwood pitched backward into the dust, his weapon unfired, and his reign of terror finally ended. His last 2 men immediately threw down their weapons and raised their hands, clearly having no intention of dying for a dead boss. The street fell silent, except for the sound of Marlowe's labored breathing and the distant whistle of wind. Through the buildings, Cordelia lowered her father's gun and rushed to his side as he sank to his knees in the dust. "We need to get you to Doc Henderson," she said, supporting his weight with surprising strength. In a minute, Marlowe gasped, looking up at his daughter with eyes full of wonder and pride. "First, I need to say something I should have said 20 years ago." "What's that?" "I'm sorry I wasn't there, and I'm proud as hell to be your father." As the sun began to set over Copper Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, a father and daughter finally found each other after 2 decades of separation. The town would rebuild, the dead would be buried, and life would go on. But for Marlowe and Cordelia Thorne, this was just the beginning of making up for lost time. If you enjoyed this story of courage, redemption, and family bonds forged in the crucible of the Old West, hit that subscribe button to join our community of Western story lovers. Your support helps us bring you more tales of honor, justice, and the unbreakable spirit of the frontier. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.